Sri K. Chandrashekar, former Cabinet Secretary, Government of India, and Distinguished Fellow of GIFT. Professor Govinda Rao, former Director, NIPFP, and Distinguished Fellow at GIFT. Professor R. Nagaraj, former Professor IGADR, Mumbai. Professor Pinaki Chakrabarti, former Director NIPFP. Professor Suresh Babu, Professor IIT Chennai and advisor to the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Professor Lega Chakrabarti, Professor at NIPFP. Professor A.B. Jose and Professor D. Narayana, the former directors of this institute and the two balancing wings of GIFT Jumbojet. The friends of GIFT who have joined online, my colleagues, beloved students, ladies and gentlemen. It is always a pleasant duty to welcome anyone. And that duty becomes all the more pleasant when it comes to an opportunity where you are getting a chance to welcome someone who keep at very high esteem and whom you consider highly valuable and helpful to you. And that is the kind of a situation that I am today. We are going to have the panel discussion on Union Budget 23-24 and Economic Survey 22-23. I'm very happy that we have with us Sri K. Chandrashekar. And this is a kind of a formal welcome to Professor K. Chandrashekar to not only to chair the session, but also I think it is his first visit to us after kindly agreeing to be one of our distinguished professors. And such a suggestion came from the chairman of our institute, Sri K. I think let us give him a big hand. And I'm not here to introduce anyone because each one of the panelists and Sri K. Chandrashekar are so remarkable, and they have made path-breaking contributions in their own area of expertise that I don't think that there is no need of, I often say that in the Google world, introduction is almost superfluous. But to say a few sentences as a matter of courtesy, here is a person who belonged to the 1970 batch of Indian Administrative Service, and he, through his remarkable and professional competence, served in different capacities within the country and abroad, and climbed up to the topmost position that a bureaucrat in this country could imagine. And he has steered the country, and by being in the ringside of the Finance Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, he has steered the economy and the India through its most turbulent times. I'm sure this induces me to request you to read his recently published memoir, As Good as My Word. I think it's a remarkable piece. It has got very excellent reviews, and we are planning to have a book discussion on it in our institute. And as far as I am concerned, I had one of the most fruitful times in my academic career working with him in Center for Development Studies. He was the chairman of the institute. Apart from that, he was the chairman of a research program that I have been coordinating. And the manner in which he has steered that program, the manner in which he has encouraged, always always, whenever I meet him, when I get out of his room, I'm always excited. I often ask myself whether anybody coming to my room, are they put down when they go out of my room, or are they Prof? This is something which I often ask, which I don't think that I can. I mean, I'm not always like that. That reminds me that I must change. Okay. Now coming to other speakers, each one of them, I am welcoming with utmost appreciation, because they have been at different occasions so much helpful to the institute. And if we are able to make any baby steps, small changes in the academy, in any initiative, we owe a lot to each one of the panelists. And I must say that as Professor M. Govindarao, right from the faculty selection, right from the PhD design, on each and every aspect, I have never ever had a situation wherein I could not get his time, and he was very liberal in terms of supporting us. And I welcome Professor Govindarao and other speakers. Professor R. Nagaraj, he is my senior, and I think I often say that from my cardamom research to industry research, he was instrumental in doing that as my senior in Center for Development Studies. And I know we were planning to have, I'm sure that he will be able to come and spend some time with us later, which is now he has moved from Trivandrum to Pune. We hopeful of getting him over here. And similarly, Pinagi again, Professor Pinagi Chakrabarti, and Suresh Babu and Lekha Chakrabarti. These three, I would say, three remarkable young scholars. I would say that they have made their footprint clear in they are all very young scholars. They are all in the, I think 50s. I think they belong to the galaxy of upcoming academicians, not upcoming, they are already established by themselves. Thank you very much for being with us today, and also for all the support that you have been giving us. And of course, coming to my left and right, this is not that he is any, Professor A.V. Jose is no more a leftist, I suppose. And on the right side, Professor, I often say that, they are always, I mean that, I'm quoting Singapore Finance Prime Minister when he said, India and China are the ASEAN's two wings that balance us ASEAN. Similarly, they are always helpful. They are always, their advice are always useful. And whenever we need a help, they are with us. So, Professor A.V. Jose, Professor D. Narayana, welcome to this meeting. And we have other governing body members of GIFT over here online. I can see some of them. Professor Chandrashekar, again, my teacher, and I don't want to mention each one of them, and other friends of GIFT who have joined online. I most warmly, with a lot of appreciation and affection, welcome you, all of you, to this meeting. And of course, this is the people who have worked behind it, my coordinators, Dr. Anup and Dr. Kiran Kumar, of course, my colleagues, and most importantly, it is actually meant for the younger generation. These are all, when I am talking about Professor Pinaki, when I'm talking about Lekha, when I'm talking about Suresh Babu, these are all role models for you to follow. And that is why they are all here. So I welcome all of you once again, and request Sri K. M. Chandrashekar to chair this meeting and conduct the proceedings.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Professor Joseph. It is always a pleasure for me to come to Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation, because I started it when I was Finance Secretary of Kerala. That was way back in the 90s. And it was started in a small basement because it belonged to Bahadur, the former film actor. And that's how we started. And some of them are still and some of them are still here who used to work with me at that point of time. So I'm glad to see that this institution has grown. And I mean, each time I meet Professor Joseph, I talk about the future of the institution because I think there is great potential for growing this institution, particularly in the light of the liberalization of the education sector that we see, the possibility of working with others and trying to strengthen this institution, making it larger. I would really like to see such a thing happening. Now, I know that we have very distinguished economists here, great speakers, Professor, Mr. Govind Rao. Of course, we worked together in the revenue, when I was the revenue secretary. Mr. Nagaraj was with me, was with the CDS when I was the chairman. I know almost all of them. Dr. Jose, of course, Dr. Narayana, he worked with me in the planning board as well as later on when he was director of this institution. So I know all of you and I know all the others by reputation. I know you're all very distinguished economists. So I hope to gain something from this workshop or seminar or whatever you call it. I don't know what seminar, sorry. Now, I don't know why he asked me to be the chair of this session, probably because of my hands-on experience of 3 years each in preparing the state as well as central budgets. My learnings from that, from my experience with the budget, both at the central level and at the state level. One is that reaction to the budget will depend on whether one likes or dislikes the government in power. Those who don't like it will not like it at all, any budget. And those who are with the government will find reasons to support it. Generally, there is not much difference. I mean, the budgets go as they are. They're not likely to be very different from each other. Then the other thing that I learned was that there is no relationship between the economic review, economic survey, and the budget. The economic survey in Kerala is produced by the planning board, and that also is presented along with the budget documents, or maybe a day earlier. And the finance department has no knowledge of it. Likewise, the economic review at the center is produced by the chief economic advisor sitting on the ground floor of North Block, Ministry of Finance section, by the finance portion of the North Block. And he does his work while the first floor, where the minister and the secretary sit, and the tax planning division of the income tax of the direct taxes wing and the tax research group of the indirect tax wing, they work together to prepare the budget. The focus is on the budget. So there's no relationship between the two, but the fact is that a lot of good material is available in the economic review and the survey, which can be used by scholars and by writers all over the country. Then another thing that I've noticed is that many of the assumptions we make in the budget, they go wrong or are deliberately changed during the year. For example, you would recall in October 2019, the government decided to suddenly reduce the corporate tax rates from 35% to 25%. This is not part of the budget. It came in October. And it was a big change because it meant that government lost revenue of 1,44,000 crore. Then some assumptions go wrong. Then external circumstances change. You had the pandemic. You have the Russia-Ukraine war going on now. There is the impending collapse of Pakistan, which we don't know when and how that is going to turn out. But that will have an impact on the entire geopolitics, geoeconomics of the world. So it's in these are the what my learnings are from the budget. So far as this budget is concerned, one strong point here is that the public investment is likely to go up 33%, which is a substantial amount. I mean, the total expenditure from 42 lakh crore, it is going up to 45 lakh crore, and capital outlay from 7 lakh crore to 10 lakh crore, which is a substantial increase. An attempt is being made to bring the fiscal deficit down. In the current year, it's 6.7%. They say it will be 5.9% in 23-24. And it will be brought down to 4.5 by 25-26. This is, of course, a far cry from the 3% figure given in the, what is that act called? FRBM Act. So it's still a far cry, but we had reached 9.2% deficit in 2020-21. It's good also. It's good also that we have 2.4 lakh investment in the railways compared to 1.4 lakh last year. Now, these are some of the important features of this budget so far as the positives are concerned. The point really is that this is not something that happened during the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, there has been a decline in the domestic demand figures. As a consequence, there was a decline. This is not something which started in 2019. If you look at 2018, 2017, our growth rate had been coming down. We never achieved the growth rate of, say, 2003 to 2008 at any time. But here there was a clear sign of decline, which again, after the pandemic, now there is a sign that there is growth, there is optimism, there is confidence. We hope that will work. But then I read today an article by Dr. Rangarajan, jointly with Srivastava, Dr. Srivastava. He says that domestic saving is 8% and foreign inflows are 2.5%. So total availability in the market is about 10.5%. Out of that, if the fiscal deficit of states and center is 9.4%, and public sector borrowing is 1.1%, what is left for the private investment? And private investment, I think, is critical in the future. The other point I have a doubt about is whether the fiscal deficit will remain at 5.9% at all. As we know, the MNREGA, the allocation has come down sharply to only 60,000 crore this year. PM Awas Yojana, it is less than what was achieved in 2021. Same with PM Kisan Yojana. Subsidy to FCI has come down. There is hardly any allocation for the price stabilization fund in agriculture. Of course, if the denominator goes up and the GDP level goes up, then you may be able to maintain your 5.9% or achieve the 5.9%. But we have to see whether that is going to happen at all. We are still going through uncertain times. Then the other point is that, which I mentioned earlier also, if post-budget changes are made, like the October 2019 announcement on corporate tax, And we are going into an election, so we can expect some changes. Then again, all these calculations may be suspect. Anyway, we hope that the country will grow. Now there is an income tax, as you know, some changes have been made for the benefit of the middle class, giving up about 35,000 crore of revenue. Hope that will translate into demand, which will lead to more production and then to investment. Headline inflation, according to the RBI, is still 6.8%. To bring it down with a high fiscal deficit, we are putting all the pressure only on the RBI. I do not know to what extent that will work. Then the global picture we know, World Trade Organization says that the growth rate will go down from 3.5% in 2022 to 1% in 2023. There are other small things which are there in the budget, which I don't know whether it will be corrected. Like changes have been made in the real estate investment trusts, infrastructure investment trust, on the market-linked debentures, all of which may affect, I mean, some of them have not even been grandfathered, so that even if you have made an investment, assuming certain things, you will not get the benefit of this later. So all these issues are there, but let us hope that we are able to get over it and get going into the future. That's very important for the country. So I would now leave it to the experts who are real luminaries. They have really done some great work in the field of public finance to speak. The opening remarks will be by my friend and colleague, Professor Govindarao.
Good morning, Mr. Chandrashekar and distinguished panelists. I hope I am audible.
Very much, very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great honor for me. Again, it's a great opportunity to meet, at least virtually, with what a lot of my friends. In fact, as the former cabinet mentioned, we had a wonderful sort of collaboration when I was in the NIPFP as a director. In fact, he helped me during my very difficult times as the revenue secretary. Well, that's a time when we had a lot of misappropriation of provident fund money, and then it was his support that really helped me to overcome many of the problems that I had. And then again, he was the one who helped us get funding for the new building. And then obviously there were lots of other reforms that I could do with his help. I'm grateful to that. And then I'm going to talk about the budget. In fact, let me share. Sorry. Let me share the screen. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about some issues relating to the economy and then the budget. India has gone through a series of shocks during the last 3 years. You had the coronavirus pandemic and successive waves of the pandemic. And of course, when we were about to come out, then you had the Russian invasion of Ukraine and accompanying sanctions. which not only increased the commodity prices, but also created supply chain disruptions, which added to our sort of slowing manufacturing process. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why, pandemic obviously created a huge amount of liquidity from the Reserve Bank of India, because because of the lack of fiscal space, much of the interventions had to come from the Reserve Bank of India, which really created a lot more of liquidity in the system, which obviously had its impact. And as we go along, we have the economic slowdown in the Western world, and China is just coming out of the pandemic lockdown. As a result, as was mentioned by the Mr. Chandrashekar, just about 0.9% next year. I'm sorry, world is likely to grow about 2.9%. And India is, according to the survey, and the growth is between 6.2 to 6.8 and 5% next year. So the impact of all these on India has been that there has been high inflation. There have been 225 basis points of increase in interest rates, and obviously the increase in interest rates in the United States has led to quite a lot of outflow of foreign institutional investment. That has and obviously, given the fact that the world economy is slowing down, you have a lot of pressure on the exchange rate, and the exports are not growing. So you have, and obviously of the four growth engines, only private consumption is at work. You don't have the, neither the public investment, nor the private investment, nor the exports. So obviously the growth engines are stuttering. And obviously we can't go with only the private consumption as we go further. And even if you look at the current year's growth, which they talk is about 7%, it was much of the growth was in the first two quarters because of the base effect, and the second two quarters growth is much less, which is much. It's sort of a tepid growth in that sense of the term. So there has been a global slowdown, and obviously the imports from global exports are low. So when we talk about the budget, we want a lot of things, but then we also should know that we have a constitution which basically says, and which sort of center has a certain role, states have a certain role. There are concurrent to really evaluate with respect to the mandate that the central government has as far as the central budget is concerned. There have been some compulsions because the recovery is just nascent. Although the GDP has crossed the 2019-20 level, as you said in the economic survey, it is below the pre-pandemic path. Actually, it is 6 to 7% below the pre-pandemic path. I mean, to see the trajectory. And in fact, there has been a secular decline in investment right from 2011-12, when investment was 39% of GDP, and it has come down to 31-32%. Even in 2019-20, before the pandemic. And reviving the investment is crucial if you want a faster growth trajectory. And augmenting infrastructure investment, to a considerable extent, has to be done by crowding in public, by having private, by having public infrastructure investment to crowd in, private investment. And but then you have a fiscal space problem. You don't really have all that much of space. Almost 40% of the revenue receipts of the central government goes for paying interest payments. So we can't be just going on increasing expenditure. So we really have, because there is very little fiscal space available. So controlling fiscal deficit, and it is necessary to release the borrowing space for the private sector, as Dr. Rangarajan and Srivastava have mentioned in this morning in this today's Hindu newspaper. Some important features. One of the things that has happened in the last 3 years is that assumptions have been by and large realistic. In fact, one of the major thing that used to happen is that, a very optimistic forecast of revenues, which lead to all sorts of other problems. And in this, here, GDP is expected to rise only by about 10.5%, 10 to 11%. And then obviously the revenues are, revenue estimates are not very unrealistic, I would say. And this year's revenue for example, has been quite buoyant for the reason, not just because the nominal growth rate is higher, but also because there have been better tax administration in terms of matching of the GST returns with the income tax returns, and then so that has really helped to increase the. In fact, the better tax administration has been one of the factors, both for realizing higher income GST as well as income tax. And the other important thing is that she has tried, at least in the last 2-3 years, to bring in all the off-budget spending into the budget. In that sense, it's more comprehensive and a little more transparent. And in the last 3 years, there has been a much greater focus on capital expenditure than in the past, because earlier capital expenditure used to be considered to be residual. In fact, this year's 37% increase in capital expenditures comes on top of 25% increase last year. And in fact, if you see 2019-20, capital expenditure was just about 1.7% of GDP, and this become 3.3% of GDP, this year. This is proposed. And there has been an attempt at fiscal consolidation, but I'm not too sure whether the fiscal consolidation is adequate, because there is a promise to reduce the fiscal deficit to GDP to 5.9%. That means half a percentage point reduction that has been planned. Now, the problem is that she has promised, and then actually she's reiterated that first fiscal deficit will be reduced to 4.5% by 2025-26. Now, which means that in another couple of years, she has to reduce it by 1.4 percentage points from 5.9, which next year is going to be an election year, which is not going to be easy to reduce it. It would have been better to front load that, but then growth considerations were important, because that would have been done. That could have been done only by reducing capital expenditure. So she preferred to increase capital expenditure rather than reduce the fiscal deficit, because the current expenditure, revenue expenditure, if you see the overall expenditure GDP ratio, there has been a decline from over 15% to something like 14.7%. But then that way, for the reason, and the revenue expenditure increase is just about 1.2%, which means that as a percentage of GDP, the decline in the revenue expenditure is proposed. Quite a lot of it is, in fact, 3 major sources of decline are, I will come to that in a little while, basically the fertilizer and food subsidies and the allocation to National Rural Employment Guarantees, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment schemes. Fiscal deficit this year, for example, 2022-23 is contained at 6.4%, and mainly due to one, higher tax collections, because tax collections are higher by 1.6 lakh crore, and that means from 19.3 lakh crore to 20.9 lakh crore. 19.3 lakh crore was the budget estimate. Revised estimate is 20.9 lakh crore. But much more important is that GDP numbers, which forms the numerator, the denominator, that is 273 lakh crore as against 259 lakh crore assumed. In other words, if the GDP had remained at 259 lakh crore, the fiscal deficit would have been 6.8%. And it's basically the increase in the denominator that has considerably helped to maintain it at 6.4%. And there was a marginal decline in the capital expenditure from the budget estimates. Now it was 2.9% in the BE, but then it becomes 2.7%, mainly because some states have failed to, take that 50-year interest-free loan. Now, this 50-year interest-free loan is a double-edged sword. I mean, it's good, no state can refuse it, and it is also good that they get more money for capital expenditure. But at the same time, this is a way to bind the states to ensure that their borrowing limit is determined by the center. Article 293 allows the state to borrow internally, and it says that if 293 subclause 1 says that if they are indebted to the center, they have to seek the permission of the center to borrow. And after the 12th Finance Commission's recommendation, when it said that the government of India should stop intermediating the loans, obviously much of the loans that were given for plan purposes then became was stopped. So there was a time when there was a trajectory where some of the states would have come out of the central borrowing, and if that is the case, they would have come out of that. So this way, it ensures that for the next 50 years, the state governments cannot determine their volume of borrowing; it will be determined by the center. Now, the important proposals in the budget are, as far as the macroeconomics is concerned, as I said, total expenditure as a share of GDP declines from 15.3% to 14.9%. The major items of reduction are subsidies and transfers. Subsidies are food and fertilizer. Transfer is the rural poverty alleviation transfer. It is proposed to increase capital expenditure by 37.4% over the 2022-23. As I mentioned, this comes, over 25% increase last year. The outlay as a percentage of GDP has increased from 1.7 to 3.7% over the last 4 years. The main increase in this budget is national highways and railways. In fact, highways is from 4.42 lakh crore to 1.462. Railways is from 4.4 lakh crore to as against 1.4 lakh crore. That is almost 1 lakh crore more. There is also capital infusion. In the name of capital expenditure, there is a capital infusion into BSNL, MTNL of over 50,000 crore rupees. I mean, I do not know to what extent that can be called a capital investment, but I don't know whether that is the right way to go about there. The interest-free advances to states for 50 years has continued. The trend of reducing the fiscal deficit is there, as I mentioned, zero. As I mentioned, target is to reduce it to 4.5% by 25-26. As Mr. Chandrashekar mentioned, if the household sector financial saving is 8%, the foreign outflow is 2.5% of GDP. So you will have a borrowing space of only 10.5%. Out of that, if the center and the state government take away more than 9%, here 5.9 plus another 3% there, so it makes more than almost 9%, which basically implies that only 1.4%, 1.5% is available for the private sector to borrow, private sector and the public enterprises to borrow, and that could drive up the interest rates. And that could be that could create more problems. And on the one hand, you want the crowding in of investment by increasing the public spending on infrastructure, and the other, the interest rates are likely to rise. So then you have to see what the balance of these forces will be. It would have been better to front load reduction because, as I mentioned, they have to reduce by 1.4 percentage points in the next 2 years. This is a fiscal trend. You will see that tax revenue and total revenue and revenue expenditure. Obviously, the tax revenue and total revenue have, has been stagnant. Revenue, the revenue expenditure has been as a percentage of GDP has been showing a decline, and then capital expenditure shows a marginal increase. Similarly, fiscal imbalances. You see that fiscal deficit is pegged at 5.9%. Revenue deficit is pegged at somewhere about 2.9%. And you also see that the difference between revenue deficit and fiscal deficit is diverging over a period of time, which basically implies that the productivity of overall borrowed money is becoming, in fact, it's becoming less and less productive. Where have the reduction take place? As I mentioned, expenditures have been reduced. Reduction in food subsidy by 90,000 crore. Reduction in fertilizer subsidy by 50,000 crore. Reduction in Manrega is 29,000 crore. An increase in the current transfer to the states by just 1.2%. That means centrally sponsored schemes. The increase is just 1.2%, which means that the proportion of GDP declines. Proposed increase in the revenue expenditure is just about 1.2%, and as a proportion of GDP, it declines. And in the budget, of course, this is nothing new. Every finance minister makes a lot of this thing. But a lot of the budget speech was spent in talking about the 6-7 focus areas. And most of those focus areas, if you see, are either in the state list or the concurrent list. In fact, most of them are not in the union list. So we talk about the inclusive development, infrastructure development, unleashing potential, but this is more and spreading the resources across various sections, an electoral thing. But then, every budget does this, and so there is nothing much I can say about it. The tax changes, basically, there hasn't been much of a change in, there have been some tinkering of the rates in the customs, but the protectionist stance, which has started in 2017, continues. So the Atmanirbharta, so self, that will continue to be the case. As far as the income tax is concerned, the principle of taxation basically says that to broaden the base, reduce the rates and reduce rate differences. Don't take too many objectives in tax policy, and tax policy is not a Kamadhyanu. It can't be giving, your job is to raise revenue, confine it to raise revenue. But then you want to have several objectives. So, but then what they have done is, because of these objectives, you give all sorts of tax preferences. Ideally, you should get rid of all the tax preferences so that you don't have to give tax preference for saving in certain instruments, not all saving in certain instruments, which again is a gross thing, because after 5 years, you don't have to save additionally. And then, or insurance, health insurance and various other things. It's not for health, it's for health insurance. But anyway, so it would be nice to get rid of them and reduce the tax rates and reduce the number of tax brackets. They have increased the number of tax brackets. Before 1991, when Chelaya committee came into picture, there were 12 tax brackets, and subsequently it became 3. Now again, we are increasing the tax brackets, and it would be nice to have a transparent tax system. But when you say that, you have the choice between the old and the new, you are only confusing the issue. And possibly the intention, it is to go in for the new tax regime, have a clean, well worked out tax system and proceed. Let me conclude by saying that elevated fiscal deficit leaves very little borrowing space for the private sector. Fiscal adjustment next year will pose problems. Interest rates will remain elevated, interest payment will remain elevated, and interest rate also will remain elevated. And with subdued external demand, it remains to be seen to what extent private investment will take off. Overall, while public consumption will remain subdued because the government expenditure on revenue expenditure is less, public investment may increase. Spending on centrally sponsored schemes is virtually stagnant, and a reduction in the allocation for rural poverty alleviation is a matter for concern. Of course, it's a demand-driven program. They may have to increase the allocation just as they did it in 2000. But that would mean that something else has to happen. Somewhere else they have to cut, or the tax revenue has to increase. Changes in the direct taxes actually adds to the confusion. It is desirable to eliminate tax preferences and have lower rates and reduce the number of tax brackets. How well these will actually turn out to be, I mean, in a sense, increase in the capital expenditure and reduction in fiscal deficit. Particularly, how well this will work out will depend upon its implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Govindrao. Actually, I'm glad I listened to your talk, because that particular point you made regarding the long-term loan being given to the states and how it is linked to the borrowing capacity allowed under the Constitution, that is information which I did not really have. So I'm glad you mentioned that. It adds to my information. May I now request Professor Nagaraj to make his presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
I will try to upload my PPT. There could be some problem. Then, in fact, I have asked Dr. Joseph.
It is being done from here. Don't worry about it. We will do it from here.
Okay, fine. Thanks. So let me. Could you please upload it for me now, please? Hello.
It is being done.
But is there a way I can see it also so that I can?
It will be shared. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Are you able to see it?
Not yet.
It's not okay. Okay, they are opening that.
Yes, I can see it now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Thank you once again for this kind invitation. Happy to be with gift on this occasion. Yes. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is a first slide. The pandemic shock and recovery. India's GDP growth rate plunged by 6.6% in 2021, expectedly, as the rest of the world did, due to COVID-19 pandemic. This is known to us. However, output growth bounced back by 8.7% in 21-22. And the current year has witnessed further strengthening of recovery, one of the strongest in the world. I think this is something to be admitted, and I think one should give credit to the policymakers that the recovery has been pretty fast. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, sudden and repeated lockdowns led to a collapse of output, employment, and loss of livelihoods, lives and livelihood during the pandemic. Led to historically unprecedented reverse migration to rural India. Government's free food distribution program, in addition to the existing PDS under the National Food Security Act, helped stave off the crisis of hunger. This is something which I remember. I mean, I'm sure all of us will remember, was something which all of us worried, and it was a great concern. But to be fair to the policymakers, I think their program of free food distribution, with all the limitations all of us are aware of, I think has allowed us to stave off the crisis of hunger. That's something to be, I think, to be given credit to for the policymakers. For those returning to the villages, MG-NREGA provided relief. May not be in sufficient quantity, but it did provide fair amount of relief, and led to some amount of rural capital formation. There is evidence of that. Okay, with hindsight, I would say India's response seems to have looks better than many countries, especially China, which is still struggling from its ad hoc policies and harsh lockdowns. Yeah. So therefore, I think to that extent, India, in a comparative perspective, has done reasonably all right. So next slide, please. Yeah, the budget's main objective. I know there are lots of fiscal details which I would not go into, like my previous speaker, Dr. Govindrao, mentioned. I will not go into them, but I will focus more on the macroeconomic issue, especially the investment target. FM claimed that the recovery from pandemic is now complete. The budget aims to get on with growth path India charted prior to the pandemic, and this is what I think the finance minister mentioned after the presentation of the economic survey. So, that's a good signal for the budget. Look, they want to get on with growth. I mean, forgetting the 2 bad years of pandemic, 2-3 bad years of pandemic. Okay. Budget aims to pursue investment-led growth, boosting public investment by 33% over the previous year, at 3.8% of GDP. My numbers may not be exactly right. I think Govind's numbers are probably more accurate, but this is my rough number. I think this is the number. Okay. Again, this is something which has attracted a lot of attention, and everybody has, or at least the business people, business associations have hailed the budget as a growth-oriented budget. Correspondingly, the budget has reduced the allocation for MGNREGA, perhaps among other welfare schemes. I think which has been widely criticized by very progressive economists, and perhaps rightly so. So there's very little mention of unemployment in the budget. The idea seems to be that government should no more pandering to populist measures and getting on with growth. So that's the message I read from the budget, that the government wants to say it's hard-nosed about growth and it will get on with it. So my question is, does it really? Is it likely to achieve that objective? Yeah, I have my doubts. I'll express it in the next few slides. Next slide, please. Yeah, the truth behind the budget headlines. Okay, not much boost to public investment, I would contend. I will explain why. See, this is where I think the numbers can be very deceptive, because there is a difference between what we call the fiscal or capital budgeting numbers and the economist's idea of capital formation. We as economists look for capital formation because that shows the expansion of productive capacity. So the question we ask is, does the fiscal numbers likely to lead to capital formation, which will augment the productive potential of the economy? On that front, I think there is a disconnect, and very often we get confused. Therefore, I'll try to explain this, and I guess the students might like this bit of it. Because when you say capital expenditure in the budget equals to capital outlay, what we call capex, and loans and advances to the states. Govind may correct me if I'm making a mistake on this. Capex also includes centers' equity investment in PSUs like BSNL. In fact, rightly mentioned by previous speaker that there's a 50,000 crore capital infusion to BSNL and MTNL. I don't know for what purpose, but in terms of capital formation, it means nothing. Okay, it doesn't add to capital formation. Okay, so it may help pay off old debts, but does not lead to capital formation. So to that extent, this headline number of 3.3% of GDP may be spurious. Okay. Government of India seems to have improved transparency by including off-budget items. I think that may be a good thing, but this also means that there's a way to hide the actual amount of additional expenditure out of budget, which is being spent on capital formation. So net of these things, net of these, I think, net of these, the actual expenditure. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. The government has brought budget capex borrowing of various PSUs on its own books, boosting the headline number. Net of these, Government of India's capex is reduced year on year to 20.7% and 3.5% of GDP, lower than 4% in the pre-COVID year. My number seems to be higher than what Govind mentioned. Maybe Govind mentioned that actuals. This is probably the budget expenditure. Okay. So, but the point is, if you compare the budget numbers, budget estimates of this year with the pre-budget, with the pre-COVID period, I think the number is smaller. So the entire exercise of showing that, there is a boost to public investment as a development strategy or an investment strategy doesn't seem to hold much water. That is my reading of the budget. Okay. So will such public expenditure proposal drive an investment-led growth? I really wonder. So I think this is where I think the one has to look behind or beyond the headlines to know what this really means. A lot of it is for public consumption or populist media consumption. The reality may be very different, and this is my take on it. The reason for my skepticism about effectiveness of budget rises from the gravity of the situation described in the next few chapters. So the reason why I worry about public investment is for the following reasons. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I just have 3 slides, which I think is in my view, the summary of the existing macroeconomic situation, which I believe, or I think the present policymakers refuse to look at the aggregate macro numbers. Okay. India got derailed. This is something I'm very consciously using this word, that in the last decade, 2010s has been bad for India's long-term growth trajectory. India's growth rate was accelerating from 1980s to till 2010s, from 5.5% to 6.5% to 8%. Okay, I'm sure all of us are familiar with this accelerating growth path, and India became an economy which is very close behind China in terms of growth rate in 2000s. Okay, from that situation, 2010s has been a major reversal. Okay, this is something which I think the policymakers are refusing to acknowledge. Okay, and this is you see the chart, which is the official GDP numbers. It went up from 5.5% to 8.3% and went down the next 4 years. And I'm sure most of the audience here are aware of the disputes about the GDP estimates. If the alternative estimates provided by scholars like Arvind Subramaniam or Sebastian Morris, I think the number could be around 5%. If that is the truth, I think we have a hard reality to accept that India has derailed from its long-term growth path. Okay. Now the question comes whether a budget of this kind will anywhere likely to address these questions, these slowdown. I'm not very sure. Okay, next slide, please. Here is other thing. India got deindustrialized prematurely. See, I have avoided using this term for many years, but now I'm more convinced that India is deindustrialized. Okay, and here is the 2 numbers. I can add more, but again, the manufacturing growth rate as per IIP, okay, has gone down from 13% in 15-16 to negative 0.4% in 19-20. I'm not including the pandemic year. Even excluding the pandemic year, there's been a steep fall. Okay, and this is by IIP, and I'm sure similar numbers will show up by other indicators as well. This reality is something which the policymakers are refusing to acknowledge. Okay, I mean, unless you acknowledge a problem, you will not think of a solution to it. Okay, so similarly, manufacturing sector share in GDP has stagnated. I've given 2 different sets of numbers with 2 different colors by 2 different GDP series, but the stagnation in both of them is pretty evident. Okay, so this reality is something we must acknowledge before we think of addressing these issues. Okay, last slide, please. Yeah, next. Yeah, the same thing is reflected not just in sectoral but aggregate saving investment rates. Okay, these are the two graphs. You can see the first graph. It's of the long-term 20-year data. Okay, GFCF, gross fixed capital formation, the GDP at current prices, and you can see that it peaked in 2008-9 at around 38% to 39%, and declined steadily since then. In fact, this is something which I keep mentioning, that never in the last 70 years have we seen such a decline in capital formation rates. Okay, and it will be a hard climb to get back to 38, 39%, 38, 39% capital formation rates. Looking at the long term, we have taken how long we have taken to get it reduced. So this is something which is serious. We know that. I mean, stylized facts of development economics tell you that rising saving and investment rates are necessary for achieving 8 to 9%. No country in the world has achieved 8 to 9 or 7 to 8% growth rate without having investment rates of 35 to 40% or more. Okay, this is one of the stylized facts of 20th century, 21st century. Okay, and we don't seem to be aware, at least appreciate this kind of a decline which we are witnessing. Similarly, gross savings have declined. Gross domestic savings have declined. Okay, so I feel that the budget, which is claiming to be an investment-led growth, doesn't seem to address any of these long-term issues, or probably is not even willing to acknowledge that these are long-term issues which need to be addressed. So, given all this, I'm not very sure that what does the budget really does. It is basically a very conservative budget. It is stuck to its fiscal deficit target. Of course, many may see it as a virtuous. I don't see that way, because given the gravity of the problem, I think there's a need to step up public investment. As long as public investment is used for productive purpose, okay, which augments output, particularly augment output of imported goods, I think it's virtuous. Given that, I think we are unlikely to get on to a high growth path as the FM desires. Okay, given what is there in the budget. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Yeah, to conclude, okay, let me conclude. Sorry. I welcome the budget aimed at public investment-led growth. Well-designed investment plan can crowd in private investment to boost output growth. Do the budget estimates give us confidence that such a strategy is in place? I'm afraid not. Budget has stuck to its fiscal consolidation timeline. Its gross borrowing remains the same as last year. See, I as an economist, I look at the gross borrowing limits. Does it mean is the government borrowing more? Okay, of course, fiscal conservatives will say it'll lead to rise in investment interest rates for the private sector. I think that's not. I'm not so sure. But if it increases government borrowing, then I know that there's an overall expenditure is increasing. But government expenditure is increasing, which is not the case this time. What government has done is reduce, at least supposedly reduce expenditure on NREGA and other social welfare programs, and supposedly increased for capital investment. That's it. It's a reshuffling, but not an increase. Such a level of public investment is hardly adequate to revive aggregate fixed investment rate and to lift annual GDP growth rate to 78% on a sustainable basis. I'll stop it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nagarajan. I think he has given a different perspective on the budget. Before we go on to Professor Pinaki Chakrabarti, just one question. There is substantial increase in the capital outlay, which you say it is not for capital formation, but will not this capital outlay on infrastructure, on railways and so on, will that not lead to a spread effect in the sense that there will be need for more cement, for more steel, for more bricks. There will be more employment created. Income will go up. Will not, in your view, will not that have a positive effect on the economy?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chandrashekar, for this question. I see some of it will happen. I'm not denying that. Okay, but you see, suppose say 50,000 crore, recapitalization of MTNL will only go to pay its arrears. Okay, it's not going to lead to any expenditure. True, railways. I mean, I was very heartened when the railway numbers came up. You know, when the finance minister mentioned them. But look at the actual thing. What they are planning. Their emphasis is more on station development, not on rolling stock or improving the rail track. Okay, station development is a I would say relatively less important economic activity to improve efficiency of railways. Okay, I'll give more examples. So see, you know that there's a big fanfare about the introduction of Vande Bharat trains. Okay, I think it's a very positive thing for the country. We have created an indigenous rail set, and but in fact, if you see what Sudhanshu Mani, the main man behind creating the train set at ICF, has said repeatedly, look, the full benefit of Vande Bharat will not accrue unless we modernize our rail track. Our rail track is in a pretty bad shape. It cannot take trains at very high speeds. So unless you invest in rolling stock and renovating your rail track, your fancy trains is of no use. It's like having a Mercedes-Benz car and you have no pothole roads. So what's the point in having a Mercedes-Benz car? So it is that situation we are in with respect to railways. Okay. On the other hand, the government is wanting to develop station development, which is basically a real estate affair. Sure, it will create demand for cement and steel, but is that going to increase the productivity of railways or increase revenue? Probably not. So in that sense, I say that the priorities of the government don't seem to be aligned with increasing or augmenting the capacity of the economy or improving the productivity of investment. That's my answer.
Thank you very much, Professor Nagaraj. I now request Professor Pinaki Chakrabarty to speak.
Thank you, Sri Chandrashekar. And I also thank Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation for giving me this opportunity. Dr. Govind Rao, Professor D. Narayana, Dr. Joseph, Dr. Jose, fellow panelist, Dr. Nagaraj, and friends, colleagues, and dear students. So I have decided to make my presentation in 4 parts. The first part, I plan to discuss what are the continuity of policy that we observe in this year's budget when we compare with the last year's budget. And I'll discuss 3 issues. One is the focus on capital expenditure. Previous 2 speakers have talked about capital expenditure and their implications for states as well as capital investment. So I'd like to talk about it a bit more. A conservative revenue approach that we have seen in the last year and this year, what it means in terms of fiscal prudence going forward. I'd like to comment on that. Then I'll talk about fiscal consolidation. So this is the broad structure of my presentation. I am not going into the data because it's already there, and we know what the broad trends are as presented in the budget. So let me start with the issue of capital expenditure. First, there are 3 aspects to the capital expenditure as I see it. One is when we say that capital expenditure has increased this year to around 4%, 3.955%, above 3.5% of GDP. I think we have to look at the history of capital expenditure of the central government. I'm not talking about states. And I looked at the central government's capital expenditure data, mentioned here, give loans to the states, and that was before 2004-5, when the 12th Finance Commission recommended that centers should not on lend to the states, rather allow the states to go to the market. So in that, and this was taken out, the loans and advances as an item of government expenditure of the central government's capital budget taken out. The capital expenditure declined for the central government, and because they were not borrowing and then on lending to the states. So that continued till the COVID hit Indian economy. So up to 2019-20, we had a capital expenditure which was around roughly 1.5% of GDP for the central government. And general argument then was the center is not spending enough on capital, so it must spend on capital, reduce revenue deficit. So that's the first point. Now comes COVID. Central government's first COVID stimulus introduced this scheme, saying that within a year, if you are able to spend this capital money, we will give you an interest-free loan, and that amount was 12,000 crores. So that was the part of the first stimulus package of government of India, over and above the 2% extra borrowing limit that was given to the states. Then this was utilized very effectively. States found them very useful, and many states had actually suggested that this scheme should continue. So in 2021, they came up with 2021-22. The government of India actually increased allocation and gave 50 years interest-free loan with a bullet payment option after 50 years. So after 50 years in nominal term, debt is in nominal terms. So after 50 years with inflation correction, this would, and with a bullet payment interest-free, this is basically a grant which is given to the states to spend on capital, and this is over and above the FRBM requirement. So I am just not able to understand in what way it is not going to form capital formation in the states when states themselves are responsible for more than 60% of the total capital expenditure of the country. That's the issue that I want to first raise. Second issue that I wanted to raise here is the issue of revenue deficit at the state level. If we look at RBI study on state finances 2022-23 for all the states have shown revenue deficit in 21-22. States have shown revenue deficit in many states, big states have shown revenue deficit in 22-23. So if this capital expenditure in terms of loan was not given, then states' capital expenditure would have further declined. And the center's budget says that, or 76% of the money that was given has already been spent. And I had read an interview of the finance secretary. His sense is that this will further go up. And out of this 1 lakh crore, I have read the design and the guideline of the scheme. 80%, that means I'm talking about last year, 1 lakh crore will be given. Out of 1 lakh crore, 80% of this money is given to the states based on the 15th Finance Commission's devolution formula. So this is completely untied. So if we are talking about nudging the states to do capital expenditure by giving interest-free loan, it's true, but it is true for only 20% of the total money that is given to the states, and where there are separate schemes for the center. And in this year, that untied capital loan is 1 lakh crore, which will be given to the states based on the Finance Commission's formula. But rest 30,000 crore will be based on the central scheme that was listed in the budget, like, you know, National Digital Library, Urban Bond, Urban Reform Program. There are so many schemes there. This 30,000 crore will be allocated based on state proposals, state schemes, and all those details. Now that's the way it has been designed. So there is a flexible component which is very large, and there is a tight component which is around 20 to 30%. So that's the broad number. Now in the second scheme, in this year's scheme, they have also introduced an additional clause, and that clause is that yes, it will be given based on 1,30,000. It will be given based on the devolution formula proposed by the Finance Commission. But if that amount crosses 1% of GSDP of the state for that year, then the rest of the amount will be deducted from the borrowing limit. So that's the catch. This has a problem in the sense that the states which have got high devolution share and will naturally be getting a large amount of money. I have not done this exercise, but I am doing it. So if they get, larger share of this money, in that case, and if that is higher than GSDP, they would probably get less in terms of the market borrowing. So this is the issue that I think is important. It's not about there is no capital expenditure. It has just been done to say that yes, center wanted to do capital expenditure, and that's why it has given to the loans to the states, and then they want to put conditionality. That's absolutely not correct in my view. I would like to be if there I would like to, if there are any issues, I'm happy to answer. So that's the first. That's the second point. The third point, the last point that I wanted to mention here is about this 50-year interest-free loans to the states, is to bind the states and take and ensure that they take permission from the central government to the states, central government while borrowing. I think that's a very prudent provision of the Constitution. I think that's an absolutely prudent provision of the Constitution. I had looked at the constitutional debate, read it very carefully before this meeting, even earlier also, and also discussed with a couple of others. It is mentioned in the constitutional debate that the state loans, states are not sovereign entities. The union government is a sovereign entity. So the loans given to the state is unsecured loans. So central permission is kind of gives a sovereign guarantee to the state loans. So in the absence of sovereign guarantees, there are two things that can happen. The first thing is that it can bring in huge market discipline at the state level. So the center says, I don't give guarantee, I don't give permission. So if the market gives you money, you go and borrow. No problem about it. I have no problem about it. If that is the case, if a state is fiscally
Can't hear you.
It says I have been muted by the host. Am I audible?
You're audible. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So if a state goes to the market and there is no central guarantee and without the permission of the center, that means it's an independent entity going to the market to borrow. It has to have the market discipline, and there is no implicit guarantee of the center. So this can bring in market discipline. At the same time, there is a risk that if a state goes to the market and if there is no central government's involvement in this, they may not also be able to realize what they wanted to realize as resources from the market. So there are issues. I think these are complex issues of how we should discuss this constitutional provision and what are its implications in terms of borrowing, because states' entire capital expenditure is financed by borrowing because revenue deficit is emerging in states post-COVID. There is no major revenue surplus. Planned financing has gone. So capital expenditure will have to be an important source of capital investment at the state level. What is the prudent, sustainable, and macro-stable way to control, to allow the states to borrow without creating macroeconomic stability? I think is an important issue that we need to discuss in light of the changes that has happened in terms, including the interest-free loans that is given to the states. Last point that I wanted to mention here is the issue of revenue deficit of the center. Now, revenue deficit of the center is 2.9% of GDP, and That's the estimate. And the center's government outstanding debt as per the medium-term fiscal plan presented in the budget, it's 57.2% of GDP. So I'm sorry, I have a very bad throat today. 57.2% of GDP. And the interest payment is 3.6% of GDP. Last year, the interest payment was 3.65% of GDP. So the kind of contraction, and last year revenue deficit was more than 4% of 4.4% of was 4.4% of GDP. So the kind of contraction that we have seen in the revenue deficit is primarily because there has been a reduction in the allocation for CSS. And some of these allocations are for right-based schemes. If the economy does not recover and people fall back on right-based employment program, MG, NREG, and its allocation goes up. If food subsidy bill continues to mount like the way it has increased this year through a supplementary demand for grant for 3 lakh crore, if the subsidy bill continues to go up, we may still have a larger revenue deficit. And then the capital expenditure that we are seeing in terms of center's own capital spending, not the loans, I think will further decline. So that's the challenge that we have in the fiscal front. But one approach that I have seen in this last 2 years budget is always is about estimating GDP growth at 10-11%, and then having a revenue buoyancy less than 1. And so you get some kind of a fiscal headroom if the inflation rate is high and nominal GDP growth rate is higher, and then you see a higher revenue mobilization. Apart from, of course, technological changes and the increase in base also has affected, but inflation plays a major role in increasing the denominator and give you a better ratio in terms of fiscal deficit and revenue deficit. So I always that cushion is there in this year's budget also. But in the long run, the structural problems like high interest burden, which is 3.5 even now, 3.57 even now, has to come down by reduction in debt, and a larger fiscal correction I would have expected in this budget, and getting to 4.5 faster than the time proposed would have resulted in reduction in interest burden to GDP ratio and freeing up resources for development, both in the revenue account and in the capital account. Thank you very much.